David Carter adjusted his cufflinks, glancing at his Rolex as he navigated through the crowded terminal of Chicago O'Hare International Airport. At 48, he had everything a man could want, or so it seemed. Wealth, power, and the prestige of being a self-made millionaire. Dressed in a tailored navy suit and carrying a sleek leather briefcase, he exuded the confidence of a man who had conquered the business world. Yet, beneath the polished exterior, there was an emptiness. An ache he rarely allowed himself to acknowledge. That Friday morning, David was in a hurry, headed to New York for another high-stakes deal. But just as he passed a coffee kiosk, a flash of familiarity stopped him in his tracks. A woman with wavy brown hair, her posture upright but graceful, walked by, holding the hand of a young boy. David's heart lurched. Emma? He barely breathed her name, his mind reeling. It had been 10 years since he had last seen her. Since the night he had left their small apartment, slipping away while she slept, leaving only a cold letter behind. A letter that severed their life together in one cruel instant. But it wasn't just seeing Emma that rattled him. It was the boy. A child of about 10, with tousled blonde hair and piercing blue eyes, eyes that mirrored his own. Even the way he walked, slightly bouncing on the balls of his feet, was hauntingly familiar. David felt the blood drain from his face. Could it be? Had Emma been pregnant when he left? Had he abandoned not only the woman who once loved him but a son he never knew existed? His legs wobbled, and for the first time in years, the weight of regret crushed him. He had spent the last decade chasing wealth, seduced by promises of luxury and power whispered by Victoria, the woman who had introduced him to a world of high-stakes business and opulent living. He had convinced himself that leaving Emma was necessary, that she, a simple schoolteacher, could never understand his ambitions. But now, standing in a bustling airport, surrounded by the faceless rush of travelers, none of it mattered. His success, his fortune, his elite lifestyle, all of it felt hollow. David stepped forward, pushing through the crowd, desperate to reach them. Emma, he called, his voice drowned out by the airport's noise. She didn't turn. He pushed past travelers, his heart pounding, his pulse in his ears. He had to talk to her. He had to know. But just as he broke free of the throng, he saw them disappear through a set of automatic doors. Gone. David stood frozen in place, his breath shallow, his mind racing. His phone buzzed. Victoria. He let it ring. A flight attendant's voice jolted him back to reality. "Sir, your flight is boarding." David looked toward the gate, then back toward the exit where Emma and the boy had vanished. In that moment, for the first time in years, he made a different choice. "I'm not getting on that plane," he said. And with that, David turned and walked away, toward the past he had abandoned, and the truth he could no longer ignore. 10 years earlier, David Carter had been a different man. He wasn't the wealthy, suit-clad businessman striding through airports with a briefcase full of contracts. Back then, he was just David, a hard-working young man with dreams, a modest apartment, and a woman who loved him with all her heart. Emma Reynolds had been his anchor. A schoolteacher with a warm spirit, she had believed in him long before he believed in himself. Their life together wasn't glamorous, but it was full of quiet, everyday happiness, evening walks in their Chicago neighborhood, home-cooked dinners at a small wooden table, lazy Sunday mornings with records spinning on an old turntable. She had a way of making life feel rich even when money was tight. But David had always wanted more. It started with small things, envying the men in his office who wore $1,000 watches and drove sleek sports cars, the way they carried themselves with effortless confidence. They weren't worried about paying rent or affording a last-minute weekend getaway. Then came Victoria Lancaster. She was everything Emma wasn't: powerful, ruthless, dripping in wealth. An executive at a major investment firm, Victoria saw something in David: raw ambition. She fed it, nurtured it, made him believe he was meant for more than a middle-class life in a cozy apartment. "You have potential, David," she had told him one evening, sliding a glass of scotch into his hand at an upscale New York bar. "But you're playing too small. I can help you get where you really belong." She made him feel hungry for something he couldn't quite define: status, power, the kind of success that would make people look twice when he entered a room. Slowly, his world shifted. Business trips became more frequent. Dinners with Emma turned into late nights at networking events. The scent of home-cooked meals was replaced by the sterile air of hotel rooms. And Emma noticed. "David, we barely talk anymore," she had said one evening, sitting across from him at their tiny kitchen table, her eyes filled with worry. "I feel like I'm losing you." He had waved it off, insisting it was just a phase, that he was doing this for them. But deep down, he knew he was lying, to her, to himself. Emma had dreams too. She wanted to go back to school for her master's degree, to become a principal one day. But every time she brought it up, David dismissed the idea. "What's the point?" he had said once, flipping through the pages of a business journal. "It's not like you're going to make much more money teaching." The hurt in her eyes should have made him stop. Instead, he kept pushing forward, determined to escape the life they had built together. Then came the breaking point. One autumn evening, Victoria gave him an ultimatum: fully commit to the world she was offering, or risk being left behind. That night, as Emma slept peacefully beside him, David made his decision. He packed a small bag, wrote a cold, emotionless note, and walked out the door without looking back. David had convinced himself it was the right choice. At first, it had been exhilarating: penthouse suites, expensive suits, a life of first-class flights and high-stakes deals. But no matter how much success he achieved, there was a hollow space inside him. What he didn't know was that just days after he left, Emma had stood in their tiny bathroom, clutching a pregnancy test in trembling hands. 2 pink lines. She had collapsed onto the floor, sobbing. Not just from heartbreak, but from sheer panic. How would she raise a child alone? The months that followed were the hardest of her life. She had been forced to scrape by, working extra hours at school, barely making ends meet. She sold off things they once bought together: David's old leather chair, their weekend getaway fund, even the engagement ring he had once slipped onto her finger with a promise of forever. And she never heard from him again. Through sheer determination, she built a life for herself and her son, Liam. She sacrificed everything to give him a happy childhood, skipping meals so she could buy him school supplies, taking on tutoring jobs just to afford his birthday gifts. Meanwhile, David had continued climbing the corporate ladder, blind to the life he had left behind. Until that day at the airport. Until he saw the boy who looked just like him. And suddenly, everything he had walked away from came crashing back. David Carter sat in the back seat of a yellow cab, staring out at the familiar streets of Chicago. The city had changed over the years: new high-rises, trendy coffee shops, the ever-present hum of life moving forward. But he had changed too, though perhaps not in the ways that mattered most. He clutched his phone, debating his next move. The last 10 years had been a blur of success and excess, but now, for the first time in a decade, he felt the weight of what he had lost. Emma. And Liam. His son. A son he had never met. Swallowing hard, he dialed a number he hadn't used in years. "Frank? It's David. I need your help." Frank Mercer had been an old friend, a former cop turned private investigator. David had no doubt he could find Emma and Liam. What he didn't know was whether they'd want to be found. 3 days later, David sat in a dimly lit diner on the city's north side, his fingers tapping against a lukewarm cup of coffee. Frank slid into the booth across from him, setting a thin folder on the table. "She's still in town," Frank said, his voice low. "Never left. Lives in a small house on Maple Street. She's been raising the boy alone. No sign of any contact from you, no legal battles, no requests for child support." David flinched. Of course there weren't. He had disappeared. Frank hesitated before continuing. "One more thing. She's in a relationship. 2 years now, with a guy named Ryan Mitchell." David felt a twinge of jealousy, though he had no right to it. He had chosen his path. And she had moved on. Still, the image of another man, a stranger, raising his son made his stomach twist. What kind of guy is he? Frank shrugged. By all accounts, solid. Works in construction, owns a small contracting business. Locals say he's good with the kid. David let out a slow breath, unsure whether to feel relief or resentment. "Look," Frank said, closing the folder, "you really want to do this? You can't just waltz back into their lives and expect a warm welcome." "I know," David admitted. "But I have to try." That evening, he found himself parked down the street from Maple Street's modest row of houses. From his car, he watched as the front door of Emma's home swung open. She stepped out, her auburn hair catching the glow of the porch light, her face more mature but just as beautiful as he remembered. Then, Liam appeared. David's breath caught in his throat. The boy had his build, his eyes, even the way he ran toward a bike propped against the porch railing. A man followed them outside. Ryan. He ruffled Liam's hair, laughing at something the boy said. Emma smiled at them both before locking the door and heading toward the car. David's hands gripped the steering wheel. This was a family. A real, functioning, happy family. And he had no place in it. The temptation to drive away, to leave them in peace, was overwhelming. But then he thought of Liam. Thought of how much he had already missed. No. He wouldn't disappear again. The next afternoon, David finally gathered the courage to approach. As Emma stood outside watering her front garden, he stepped onto the sidewalk, his heart hammering. Their eyes met. The watering can slip from her fingers, splashing water onto the pavement. "David," she whispered, her face a mixture of shock and disbelief. "Emma," he said, his voice barely steady. A silence stretched between them, thick with 10 years of unanswered questions. Then her expression hardened. "What are you doing here?" David swallowed. "I saw you. At the airport. He hesitated. "With him." Emma's jaw clenched. "You don't get to say his name. You don't get to show up like this." "I didn't know," David admitted, voice raw. "If I had." "What?" she snapped. "You wouldn't have left? You would have been a father?" She shook her head, anger flashing in her eyes. "You made your choice, David." He exhaled, knowing she had every right to be furious. I just want to meet him." Emma stepped closer, her voice barely above a whisper. "No." David's stomach dropped. "He has a good life," she continued. "A stable home. A man who's been there for him since he was small. I won't let you waltz in and tear that apart." David felt the sting of her words, but before he could respond, the distant rumble of a school bus made them both turn. Liam hopped down the steps, his backpack bouncing as he ran toward the house. Emma's face went pale. "Go," she hissed, panic flashing in her eyes. But David couldn't move. For the first time, he saw his son up close. The boy slowed as he reached the sidewalk, glancing between them, sensing the tension. "Mom?" Liam asked, frowning. "Who's that?" David's throat went dry. Emma forced a smile, her voice steady but strained. "No one, sweetheart. Just an old friend." Liam eyed him briefly before shrugging and running inside. As soon as the door shut, Emma turned back to David. "I mean it, David. Stay away." He watched her walk inside, the door slamming behind her. And just like that, he was shut out again. But this time, he wasn't going anywhere. David Carter had never been a man who backed down from a challenge, but standing outside Emma's house, staring at the closed door, he felt a deep, unfamiliar fear. He had lost her once. Would he lose his son before ever getting the chance to know him? Emma's words echoed in his mind, "Stay away." But how could he? Liam was his blood. His child. And though David had made terrible mistakes, he wasn't about to walk away again. Over the next few days, he found himself drawn back to Maple Street, watching from a distance. He didn't have a plan, just a growing desperation to find a way in. Then, one afternoon, an opportunity presented itself. Liam was outside, kicking a soccer ball in the front yard. David, pretending to be just another passerby, casually approached from across the street. "Nice kick," he said, trying to keep his voice light. Liam glanced up, wary but curious. "Thanks." David hesitated. "You play on a team?" "Yeah, rec league." Liam stopped short, correcting himself. "Ryan's been coaching me." David swallowed hard. Of course. Ryan had stepped in where David had vanished. "You must be pretty good," David said, forcing a smile. Liam shrugged. "I guess." Then, after a pause, he added, "You're that guy from the other day. The one Mom was talking to." David's heart pounded. "Yeah, he hesitated. "I used to know your mom a long time ago." Liam studied him, something flickering in his blue eyes. Recognition? Instinct? But before David could say more, the front door swung open. Inside, Emma's voice was sharp. Protective. Liam sighed but didn't argue. He grabbed his soccer ball and ran up the steps. Emma stepped forward, her arms crossed. "I told you to stay away." "Emma, please," David said. You just what?" She snapped. "You think you can stroll back into our lives and pretend like the last 10 years never happened? Like you never walked out on me? On him?" David flinched. "I didn't know about him," he said quietly. Her eyes flashed with anger. "And if you had? Would it have made a difference?" He didn't answer. Because the truth was, he didn't know. Emma shook her head, stepping back. "I won't let you hurt him, David. I won't let you come in and turn his life upside down." "I don't want to hurt him," David said, his voice raw. "I just want a chance to be his father." Emma exhaled, shaking her head. "It's not that simple." And then, as if fate wanted to twist the knife deeper, Ryan's truck pulled up. Ryan stepped out, his expression shifting from confusion to something darker as he took in the scene. "Everything okay?" he asked, his protective instincts kicking in. "Fine," Emma said quickly. Ryan's eyes flicked to David. "Who's this?" Emma hesitated. Before she could answer, David did it for her. "I'm Liam's father." The words hung in the air like a bomb waiting to explode. Ryan tensed. "You're what?" Emma ran a hand through her hair, sighing. "It's complicated." Ryan's jaw tightened. "Complicated?" "Emma, you told me he was gone. That he wasn't coming back." "I thought he wouldn't," she admitted. Ryan turned back to David, his voice low and firm. "So, what, you think you can just show up and play dad now? After 10 years? David held his ground. "I know I don't deserve it, but yes. I want to be part of his life." Ryan let out a bitter laugh. "And what happens when you decide this isn't convenient anymore? You just disappear again?" David clenched his fists, guilt and frustration colliding. "I won't walk away this time." Ryan scoffed. "Well, that's not your call, is it?" Before David could respond, a new voice cut through the tension. "Is it true?" "Liam." The boy stood on the porch, eyes wide, his small hands gripping the railing. Emma and Ryan froze. David's chest tightened. This was it. The moment he had been dreading. Emma stepped forward. "Liam, sweetheart. Is he really my dad?" Liam interrupted, his voice shaking. Silence. Then Emma nodded, tears pooling in her eyes. Liam looked at David, confusion, anger, and something else, betrayal, flickering across his face. "You left us," he said, his voice barely a whisper. David swallowed the lump in his throat. "I did. And it was the worst mistake of my life." Liam's lip quivered. "Then why are you here now?" David took a shaky breath. "Because I want to make it right." Liam stared at him for a long moment. Then, without another word, he turned and ran inside, slamming the door behind him. Emma closed her eyes, pain etched into her face. Ryan exhaled, shaking his head. "You happy now?" David wasn't. He had wanted a chance. Now, he wasn't sure if he had just lost it forever. Meanwhile, across town, Victoria Lancaster poured herself a glass of wine, her lips curling into a smirk. She had been following David's little family reunion from a distance, waiting for the perfect moment. With one phone call, she could destroy whatever hope he had of redemption. And she planned to. David might think he could rewrite the past. But Victoria? She was going to make damn sure he paid for it. David Carter sat in his dimly lit hotel room, staring at the headlines flashing across his phone screen. Business tycoon accused of fraud, federal investigation underway. His stomach twisted. He had known this was coming the moment Victoria entered the picture again. She never lost, and she never let go. The phone buzzed in his trembling hand. Victoria. He let it ring, gripping the edge of the desk as his entire world crumbled around him. The empire he had built, the wealth he had chased, the power he had once held, gone. And yet, none of it mattered. Not compared to the pain in Liam's eyes. Not compared to the way Emma had looked at him before she shut the door. He had come back to rebuild something real, but now it seemed everything was slipping through his fingers faster than he could hold on. Another call. This time, from a number he never expected. Emma. His heart pounded as he answered. Emma? Her voice was strained. David, we need to talk. Now. They met at a quiet diner on the outskirts of town. It was late, the place nearly empty except for an old man nursing a cup of coffee at the counter and a tired waitress flipping through a tabloid. Emma sat across from him, arms crossed. Her face, usually so composed, was drawn with worry. I saw the news, she said. Is it true? David exhaled, nodding. I won't lie to you. There were things I did in business that I shouldn't have. I got greedy. Made bad deals. And now, it's catching up with me. Emma studied him. Are you going to prison? David swallowed. Probably. For the first time in days, the weight of it settled in his chest. He had spent years running from accountability. Now, he would have to face it. Emma sighed, looking down at her hands. Liam's confused. He's angry. But he's asking questions. David sat up straighter. About me? She nodded. He doesn't know what to do with all of this. He thought his life was set. Now, suddenly, he has a father he never knew existed, and that father is, she hesitated. A mess. David let out a humorless laugh. That's putting it kindly. Emma's gaze softened for the first time. I don't know if he'll ever forgive you, David. But I think he deserves the choice. David nodded. I'll take whatever I can get. The next evening, Liam sat on the back porch, kicking his feet against the wooden steps. David stood a few feet away, his hands shoved into his jacket pockets. He had never been this nervous in a business deal, never felt this unsure before stepping into a negotiation. But this wasn't business. This was his son. I don't know why you're here, Liam said without looking at him. David swallowed. Because I should have been here a long time ago. Liam scoffed. Little late for that. David sighed, stepping closer. You're right. And I won't make excuses. He hesitated, his voice quieter now. But I want you to know that leaving your mom was the biggest mistake I ever made. Liam finally looked up, his blue eyes flashing with something David couldn't quite place. If it was such a big mistake, why'd you do it? David hesitated, then sat down on the steps beside him. Because I was selfish. I thought money and success would make me happy. I thought love wasn't enough. But I was wrong. Liam didn't say anything for a long time. The only sound was the faint hum of crickets in the distance. Then, his voice barely above a whisper, he asked, Are you gonna leave again? David's heart clenched. No, he said. Not by choice. But I might have to go away for a while. Liam frowned. Because of the stuff on the news? David nodded. Yeah. And I won't ask you to forgive me, Liam. I don't deserve that. But I hope, someday, you'll give me a chance. Liam stared at him for a long moment. Then, to David's shock, he shifted slightly closer. Mom says I can decide if I want to know you. David swallowed the lump in his throat. That's right. Liam kicked at the dirt, then muttered, I don't know yet. David let out a breath he didn't realize he was holding. It wasn't much. But it was something. Take all the time you need, he said softly. Across town, Victoria watched the news with satisfaction. David Carter was finished. His accounts were frozen, his investors had fled, and by morning, the authorities would be at his door. Still, something about his downfall didn't sit right with her. She had seen his face on the news earlier, not the desperate, angry man she had expected, but someone, at peace. Her phone buzzed. A message from an unknown number. I'm turning myself in. This ends tonight. Victoria's smile faltered. Because for the first time in years, David Carter had made a decision she couldn't control. The courtroom was silent as the judge's gavel echoed, sealing David Carter's fate. 2 years in federal prison, the judge declared, and full restitution of funds. David stood tall, accepting the sentence without protest. For the first time in his life, he wasn't running from his mistakes. As he turned to leave, he caught a glimpse of Emma sitting in the back row, her expression unreadable. Next to her, Liam sat stiffly, arms crossed, his face shadowed with emotions David couldn't quite decipher. But the fact that they were there at all, that Liam had chosen to come, was more than he had hoped for. Prison was a far cry from the penthouses and luxury boardrooms David had once occupied. The cold walls, the rigid schedule, the loss of freedom, it was humbling. But for a man who had spent a decade consumed by greed, it was also a form of redemption. He used his time wisely. He enrolled in business ethics courses, worked in the prison library, and wrote letters, dozens of them, to Liam. Some went unanswered. Others came back with short, cautious replies. Then, one day, after nearly a year, a letter arrived with just 4 words. "Can I visit you?" David sat on his cot, staring at the paper, his hands shaking. Liam wanted to see him. The first visit was awkward. Liam sat across from David in the sterile visiting room, picking at the hem of his sweatshirt. "You look different," Liam muttered. David chuckled. "Prison does that to a man." Liam shifted. "I read some of your letters." David nodded. "And?" Liam shrugged. "I don't know. You say a lot of stuff. But words don't mean much." David swallowed. "I know. That's why I want to show you I mean them." Liam hesitated, then, almost reluctantly, asked, "Do you still like soccer?" David smiled, warmth spreading in his chest. "I used to be pretty good." Liam's lips twitched in the smallest of grins. "I bet I could beat you now." David laughed. "I'd like to see you try." It wasn't much, but it was a start. By the time David was released, things had changed. Emma and Ryan were married now. Liam had a stable home, a father figure who had never left. And David? David was starting over. He took a job at a nonprofit, using his business skills to help struggling small businesses. He rented a modest apartment, far from the lavish life he once knew. And every Sunday, he met Liam at the park. They kicked a soccer ball, talked about school, about life. The wounds of the past weren't fully healed, but there was progress. One evening, as they packed up their things, Liam hesitated. Then, without looking up, he said, "See you next week, Dad." David froze. Then, with a lump in his throat, he whispered, "Yeah, son. See you next week." And for the first time in a long time, he knew he was exactly where he was meant to be. Life has a way of teaching us lessons when we least expect it. David Carter's story is not just about mistakes and redemption, it's about the preciousness of time, the weight of our choices, and the power of second chances. Many of us, as we grow older, look back on our lives and wonder, did I make the right choices? Did I spend enough time with the people who mattered? Regret is a heavy burden, but as David learned, it's never too late to make things right. One of the most profound lessons in his journey is that wealth and success mean little without love and family. He chased financial security, believing it would bring happiness, only to find himself alone, longing for something he had once taken for granted. This is a reminder for all of us. True success is not measured in money, but in the relationships we build and nurture. Another key message is that forgiveness takes time but is always possible. Liam didn't forgive his father overnight, and Emma didn't immediately welcome David back into their lives. Healing requires patience, persistence, and humility. If we've hurt someone in the past, we may not be able to undo the pain, but we can take steps to show, through our actions, not just words, that we have changed. Finally, David's story reminds us that even when life seems to fall apart, there's always an opportunity to rebuild. No matter our age or mistakes, we can always take steps toward being better parents, better friends, better people. Because at the end of the day, what truly matters is not where we've been, but what we choose to do next.